Hi, friends, and welcome to the session today. I'm joined by co-authors Jay McCann and Dr. Stephen Antonoff, and we're calling this How to Use the College Finder and Other Tools to Discover Great Schools. But some of what we'll be covering today are a wide range of things, from how do you figure out what you're looking for in a college search, how do you contextualize rankings, to even, practically speaking, what are the steps to actually developing a college list? So as we jump in here, I don't normally do the sort of standard bio thing, but I'm going to do the standard bio thing. And I'd love to start by introducing Jay. Jay McCann is the co-author of The College Finder, now in its fifth edition. He earned his graduate degree at San Diego State University, where he was part of the Native American Scholars and Collaborators Grant, focusing on education and community engagement. He started his counseling career in Denver Public Schools, where he served as department chair before moving to Valor Christian High School and now the Westminster Schools in Atlanta. And he's the founder of Future Defined College Consulting. He also notes that he and his wife Erin fight off getting too much sleep by having three small children. Before I go over to Steve, Jay, I'd love to know what's a role or identity that is not listed in your bio that you feel like is also important if I were to know who Jay is.
Uh, okay, game time decision. I would go with collector, because I obviously you know what the book's about, but I love playlists. I love like a best of. I'm a sucker for any type of algorithm where I can think about movies and music and all those fun things. So,
Love it. Love it. As for Steve, he's spent over 30 years of experience in higher ed, including founding Antonoff Associates in 1981. He's counseled thousands of students and families. He's got a PhD in human communication studies, an MA in education, a BS in psychology. I also have a BS, so insert joke here. He's the former dean of admission and financial aid, and many other things, including dean of students at the University of Denver. He's the author of College Match, The College Finder, and other books that are sort of like the textbooks in independent educational consulting. And he's taught counseling and educational consulting principles. He's the recipient of IECA's Professional Achievement Award, which was actually renamed the Stephen R. Antonoff Award in his honor, and is so deserving. Steve, welcome, and give us a role or identity that is important to you that's not listed in your bio.
First, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Ethan. Looking at the list, I would say ambassador for me. I feel
Hmm.
like I am kind of a bridge between colleges and students and try to interpret what colleges have to offer to students, and in some ways I'm an ambassador both for colleges and for students in this process.
I love that. That feels really, really true. Thanks. So let's start talking about discovery and fit. So, Steve, first question for you. What do you feel like students need to understand about themselves before they even start their college search?
Um, well, the first thing I think they need to understand is that they will be confused. And I think it's okay to be confused. And I think a good college search starts with that confusion. In addition to that, I think they need to understand that they are in control, that
Hmm.
they have the power to pick from many hundreds, thousands of great colleges. So I think that that is something that they need to understand. And finally, I think they need to understand that finding a good college takes time, and it's not easy, and it's going to take several hours of research, and we can talk about the ways to research later. Those are the things that come to mind when I think of what students need to understand at the beginning of their search.
And when it comes to like finding this thing we call fit, which I'd love for you to maybe say what that is and means, because some folks on this session or listening to this podcast are not going to know what we mean when we say finding your fit. I'd love to hear, first of all, what is fit in your view? And what are some like two or three ways that maybe prompts that students could use when they're trying to figure out fit criteria?
Well, I consider fit to be a place where a student is going to learn more about themselves and the world, a place in which they are going to grow in all the ways that we expect young people to grow, and where they will be happy.
Mhm.
So to me, those are the critical elements of finding a good fit.
Yeah. And what are some of your favorite prompts for helping to surface, as it were, some of those, those dimensions of fit that are important?
Well, um, I think what we want to do is go beyond the typical search where you're looking for where you're quickly dismissing size very early. You're saying I only want a big school, I only want a small school. I think that fit comes from looking at those variables in a very reasoned way. For example, in terms of size, I like to ask students what size is best for them academically,
Mhm.
and then what size is best for them socially.
Mhm.
Because it very well may be that the right size academically is different than the right size socially, and that's a discussion that students need to have with their counselors, with their parents, and others. Same with location. It's very easy to look at location only on the basis of weather, or only on the number of sunny days, or something like that. But what you're talking about here is an academic environment that works for you. And there is great advantage for some students to be in a very isolated location. And I think too few students take the time to really think through each of those factors and how it will affect them.
Mhm. Jay, question for you. Sometimes in, college counseling, we've got what we call like these vague wishes of like, I want a strong community or I want a school that has good outcomes. How would you suggest that students take those somewhat abstract terms and turn them into things that they can actually research?
That's a good question. When I think of like good community, it's funny because it is so nebulous that it could mean like a really good cheering section on a Saturday at football games, or it could be um, like a really strong Greek presence, Greek life, or it could be like a great allyship with LGBTQI partnership communities. And then I also think of like just simply representation on an identity that I carry, right? And so I think it's interesting like that question about good community stirs up a lot of different possibilities. One of the things I always like to start off with is asking students about what their high school does for like good community, right? Like how does this provide what in what ways is your school have good community? What ways does it not? And I find that I can actually get to a little bit more when I start to reflect on what the high school experience has been. Um, and some of these, again, nebulous terms that are still kind of moving around. Like good outcomes, right? It feels like a moving target because you're asking for outcomes that are, probably at the time 5 years out. Um,
Right.
so it's yet to be seen. And I know there's a lot of anxiety about what's happening in the job market these days. So I guess things that I like to consider is like measures of success, right? That people would ascribe to is um, I start to think about like good outcomes and asking questions about major, right? I always like College Scorecard is such a good resource because I like that I can start to pay attention to if that is about a salary conversation because I feel like it always floats into that. That's a really good resource to speak specifically about what it is on a college. Um, I also think about success by student groups, like what's the graduation rate by like first generation students or even male versus female. Like these are like little interesting things that you can start to pay attention to
Mhm.
as you look by identity. And then there's always like the good outcomes that you can pay attention to with um, that we like ones that I found really fun in our book of like paying attention to Fulbright scholars or Peace for America, and some of these other different ways that you can play out. And I think all of them are trying to just get at this bigger sense of like when we're creating filters. Um, Early on in our book, we have like a questionnaire where you start to get at the sense of like, are you looking by major? Or are you looking by just like selectivity? And I think sometimes just knowing what chapter you're even in is a good starting point. So.
Yeah. When you see students go through this process, what are some of the common mismatches that you see between what students say they want and what actually what the actual schools on their list are?
Yeah, I think Steve already kind of mentioned it. Was one of them was the classroom experience versus the social experience, right? I'm just gonna plug. Steve has a great thing on his website called like a college match self survey, and on there it's a great resource for students to be able to see what is a classroom setting where you might thrive, and there's a conversation there, right? Like, do you want more engagement with your classroom? And so I think that's always a good conversation to start because there is often the mismatch where they say, but I really love the Big Ten conference or, whatever it might be. The second one I think about is scholarships versus prestige. And so there's this sense of like, we really want some good scholarship opportunities. And then we also really want a certain brand or um, a certain name that we really like as a bumper sticker. And so there's sometimes a tension there about what that will look like because obviously those can be two different sides of the coin. I used to do an activity when I was in Colorado where I'd ask students to like get up and move around the room based upon their responses. And one time I asked them, how far away from home do you want to be? And
Mm.
and when I do it with juniors, they move like to the opposite side of the room, right? They want to be as far away from mom as possible. No offense, parents. But they just like think about like, oh, that's a high priority to me. And then I start to ask like, okay, so you want to leave these friendships that you might have. You're also, where's the best place to go skiing in the country, right? Like, and they start to realize like, oh, there's a lifestyle that I also really appreciate about where I'm at. And so those are the kind of three ones that I find are interesting like mismatches that go through.
I love that. Steve, I'd love to hear when a student is starting this process. You've got, first of all, such great worksheets. I'll name a few of them and we'll link to them in the show notes. But there's the college match self-survey, there's the college planning values assessment, and the audit of, college success traits, including actually the qualities that will make a college right for you. These are all worksheets that are free, that are on Steve's website that we'll link to you. How much time, I know that it's sort of like, well, it depends, but how much time do you think a student should spend? Let's say they've got, it's in September. How much time do you think is a quote unquote good amount of time for them to spend thinking about what they're looking for? Assuming that they can't just do it for months and months, that they're starting, let's say, even late in the process.
Yeah, it's hard to really say the amount of time, but some time ought to be devoted. And I think for most students, no time is devoted
Right.
to really thinking about who they are. So my feeling is that doing some of these surveys, whether it's from College Match or something that your counselor might have in his or her office, um, is absolutely essential. I think most students start with colleges before they start with a self inventory,
Right.
and that is inherently backwards. And so I encourage students to and it's not only doing a survey, it's talking to your friends and asking them how they perceive who you are. Asking your parents' friends, relatives, certainly your counselor or consultant. See how people are viewing you. All of those things, I think, can really help to get a good start on this college planning.
Yeah. One of the conversations I had with a colleague recently was, we sort of sit with this notion of like some people like to develop their college list based, like engineer a list based on the student. And some people come into this process and they want to engineer a student based on the list.
Indeed.
And that, sort of dichotomy seems to speak to a lot of what some of the tension is sometimes which we're going to get into in just a minute, when it comes to like coming into this process. What I'm hearing you say is like engineer the list based on the student instead of the other way around.
It's really important. I do think that College Finder has a whole bunch of really interesting lists in the lifestyle section. Colleges right for a contrarian, colleges right for a lover of ideas, colleges right for a leader. Those kinds of lists can prompt students to think about who they are and the sort of environment that they want in a college.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ways to like start thinking about colleges. And this is just one more practical thing for y'all, is just opening up the book and just paging through and seeing what kinds of colleges are out there just based on these lists. So one simple practical thing you can do is like just open the book and start exploring, well, what is it that I'm actually looking for? Certainly you could take the surveys and do it that way, but also just like going shopping. We sometimes joke that like students will spend more time shopping for headphones than they will like researching colleges.
Well,
Um,
it's true. It's true, and that's a shame. And that's a shame. And that's why you end up with a lot of students transferring. It's why you end up with students who are not pleased about their college search. They haven't approached it step by step.
Mm.
So let's talk about rankings for a little bit because it's something that folks often use when they're starting off. Jay, do you feel like what are rankings good for? Are you on that field of like just ignore them, or are you more like, well, in their place they're useful?
If I try to tell when I bring it out in front of families, they used to have this magazine, U.S. News and World Report, and the only time that I brought it out was when families said, "Can you help me? Like, which of these schools are going to give me scholarships?"
Mm.
And so it was like reverse scholarships hunting because I would pull up the list and I would say, start at the top, and we're going to say no from the beginning, right? So, like, look at this list. This is a long list of no scholarships that are coming to you because they only do need-based aid, right? Is inherent to their process. And so, like, we start to move down, and right around 30s, if you're really kind of standing out, you can receive some, and then you move down that list. I like it, honestly, just to give a little bit more context to families that are thinking about like that question of like, what should I see in terms of money coming back? Um, because scholarships is a big part of what people ask in the value process. So I like it in that way. But the other thing I like is rankings are becoming like more murky, as in there are like every publication has their own rankings, right? And Steve and I have joked about like um, what was it that I think what Playboy and Sierra Club and what did all these schools have in common is that like they all have a college ranking, like and that's what's kind of interesting about it is the college finder in some ways is the antithesis of college rankings because we are about trying to cut it up as many possible ways as we can. But yet you'll still see, like in the international chapter, we list some of the global rankings in there. You'll see things that are there. But I think philosophically, what we like is we want the student to show up first in the process and then start their search, right? Is I think what we're saying. And so when you start to realize there's 1,200 ways of saying this is a best college, right? Or more, right? Like the book is then I think it comes to a really fun personal process instead of it just being someone was behind, the curtain and said 5% of what we should pay attention to is the suggested outcomes for this graduation group, right? So I like it, that the possibility of us being able to put it in their place, and that's why I like is there's a smorgasbord out there. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and practically speaking, for those who aren't aware of the College Finder or haven't seen it yet, it's a book of lists. It's a book of, essentially colleges that are good for that have great engineering programs, colleges that are great for entrepreneurship, colleges, for students who need a second chance, colleges for specialized majors. So practically speaking, and just sort of like, orientation wise, that's what we're talking about here. I'd love to know, Steve, when it comes to like when you, and because we do have some counselors who are listening, when there's a family that you feel like is very prestige fixed, and they're saying, here's our list of schools, and it's Ivy Leagues or bust. What are some of the questions that you ask, or what are some of the things that you like to say in those kinds of conversations?
Yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with a great student wanting prestige. And so that's the first thing that I don't think there's any problem with looking at prestige. The problem comes with the interpretation of what is prestigious. And many students believe, and many parents believe, and many counselors, I think, believe that there's a handful of colleges that are really prestigious and the rest somehow are not. Um, I've spent my life traveling to colleges, writing about colleges, talking about colleges. I honestly feel that there are at least 200 incredibly prestigious schools. And that may be underestimating it. So I don't think the problem is looking at prestige. I think the problem is making sure that when you look at a college, you realize the many ways that a college can be outstanding and recognize those ways as being ways that you're going to fit in, be successful, be happy, and so forth.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. Um, let's talk about what constitutes value in the college experience. Jay, like even let's say maybe even go beyond starting salaries. What are some of those metrics that you look at or that you tell families to look at when it comes to assessing the value of a college education?
Oh man. Well, one of the things I really like is the Center for Education in the Workforce is Georgetown does. And so a few years ago, they did a top programs right out of college, and based on like the value of how much money you put into it as well. I think that the term is net present value. And they found like right out of the gate, a lot of two-year colleges showed up, right? And so it's interesting that when we look at like how much do we make right away, we could shortchange and say, well, then don't even get a bachelor's degree, right? Like, and so I think it was illuminating because there's a lot more ways that we could look at this. But when you look at 10 years out, once people are through their graduate and professional, there's more stark differences there. And so I think it's so hard that what you said is how do we indicate value is it is a values driven process, right? Like same as like Steve says, like people can, I find that's best not to attack families' values, right? We want to come along and find what that alignment is. So for me, I always want to start off with getting a sense of what their non-negotiables are of, as in, are you comfortable with snow or, what are those kind of things that can we look at? But then, um, starting to dial in a little bit further towards, what value could be. What sometimes I people can see there's a lot of metrics that can give you a little bit and not give you everything, right? So for instance, 6-year graduation rate
Mhm.
and retention rate, which is how many students come back their second year, are really interesting to pay attention. And you can see that it shows how students are progressing. Are they getting the opportunity to take classes and finish? But it also has a socioeconomic element to it. So it's like it's good, but it's also you have to realize there's limits to it. And I think that's the thing with all these values is we can put in a metric and have a certain thing that comes out on the other side of it.
Mhm.
I guess to me, I think about like I come from a small farming community in northern Indiana, and I have to keep in mind that for a lot of those families, they wanted the opportunity to go to college to be able to find someone they can marry and be able to come back to like a place where they can farm the land that their ancestors, had. And so it's interesting because again, this is a values given process and like how are you going to do that? Like there's a difference between Purdue and Indiana in terms of that outcome, right? Like
Right.
just in terms of how that plays out. So I I think I've lived my adult life in urban settings that aren't that way, but it's worth asking about like success. Um, I I think we as society have always historically valued like writers and educators and ministers and social workers. And so there's always these like people that are trying to create a more perfect union. Um, and I love that, right? And so I also want to ask the questions like, do you value Teach for America and those that go onto the Peace Corps or Fulbright scholarships or some of those other things that help me to see outcomes in a different light? Because you see engagement with that community so much more clearly about like there's still a mission. It just doesn't mean there's one outcome, right?
Right. When it comes to, I want to stay on sort of thinking about the value or the values of different aspects of a college or university. Steve, when a student's trying to figure out, so they're starting this process and they're like, I'm looking for colleges that are good for blank, that are good for engineering, that are good for whatever thing that they're interested in. I think oftentimes they're in the position of like just taking someone's word for it, their counselor's word for it, their friend's word for it, someone on Reddit. And what I love about the book is that it's like, here, take our word for it. We who are like a community of hundreds of counselors who contributed to this and have been vetted by people who've been doing this for 30 years. But how does a student know? So let's say they see that, Tufts is good for theater. How do they evaluate the program level strength for whatever the specific thing is at a particular college or university?
Ethan, this is got to be sort of the X factor in college planning. I have been struggling for decades to find the answer to how you determine program strength. And I have yet to determine the answer to that question.
I love this.
So I honestly think yes, you can look at co-ops and licensure pass rates and first destination data, and I encourage students to do all of that. But the reality is there is no good measure of the academic strength of particular departments. Now, there are reputational gauges.
Right.
There are a lot of lists in the book that we asked, well, in the book, there are over 375 what we call expert choice lists. And we ask the experts to identify schools that have great theater programs, that have wonderful business schools, that have great psychology programs. I trust that data a little bit more than I trust all of these individual indices of quality. The other thing about quality, and I don't want to harp on it, but quality changes so quickly. At a small college, particularly, if you have 6 faculty members in a department and 2 leave that are 2 of the leading people in that field, that is going to change. I worked at a university that was touting a particular program, and I knew it wasn't that strong. So I encourage students to do all of the checking, all of the, looking at all of the databases and so forth and so on, reading about what people feel about quality, assessing it in terms of your visit, but you're never going to know for sure about the academic quality of individual departments.
You're reminding me of that old story about grandfather's old axe, where it's like if you change out the blade and then you change out the handle on grandfather's old axe, is it still grandfather's old axe?
Right.
So
Exactly.
let's talk about culture then for a minute when it comes to, because this is such a big thing for students. Like, I want a place with a great campus culture. Are there any practical things or specific things that they can start to look for to get a sense of a campus vibe, as it were? For you, Steve, if you've got what, see what you have.
Sure. Um, well, that is one of the reasons that we wrote College Finder, is for that vibe. It's not the be all or the end all of college searching, but part of your ability to assess vibe is your ability to look at what the experts think are great schools for the contrarian. What are incredible schools for a metalhead? That's not going to be a definitive answer, but it's going to be a answer on the route to learning about culture. You also, I think some of the most valuable parts of the Fisk Guide to Colleges are the paragraphs about what the student life is like. Yeah. I think those paragraphs are more insightful than the paragraphs about academic strengths. Although there's good stuff everywhere and bad stuff everywhere. But I think looking at the paragraphs about student culture and what students are like and what the vibe is, I sometimes ask students I ask students on my visits to colleges, what's the glue that holds this place together?
Nice.
You know, is the glue outdoors? Is the glue athletics? Is the glue beer? Is it intellectual pursuit? That's one way to get a sense of vibe.
Yeah, I love that. Jay, do you have anything you'd add to that in terms of like when students are going on campus, like advice that you give to them in terms of understanding what is the community, what is the culture?
Well, I think I always ask them to stop and talk to someone who's not in admissions, right? And to like be willing to stop and slow down. And I know it's really awkward for them at 17 and like I just want to like fit in, but stopping and asking someone like, yeah, something along that same idea is like, what do people get excited about here, right? That's always helps me get a little bit more sense of, again, that glue that he said. I ask also other questions like, if you pick up the school newspaper, that's always a good kind of treat to have. But what are they doing on a Wednesday night? What are people doing on a Saturday night? And I want to get a sense, is this a suitcase campus where people are going home on the weekends? Is there some fun traditions that people kind of stay around for? And then the last question, this feels controversial, but I've been doing it for years, is I always ask people, um, who would hate going here? Because you can always get like admissions office, a lot of it is marketing, right? Is like they're trying to sell everyone on the potential of a school. But if you can ask someone to say specifically like this actually is a little bit more of a problem. And I've learned more from asking students that question than anything else, any other question, because it gives way more vibes.
I love that.
And you never want to ask, do you like it here? That doesn't tell you anything. The question is, what do you like? What are the positive features about the place? What are the negatives? As Jay said, talk about weekend life here. What happened last Saturday? I like to be as specific as possible. Do you know two professors well enough to get a recommendation for graduate school or for a job? Yeah. What clubs are you involved with? Which clubs would you say are the most popular on campus? The more specific you can be, the better chance you have of learning what that vibe is like.
And then, sorry, can I jump in on that? Like, it's the outcomes talk is even asking them, like, what are your friends that have graduated? What's their process been leaving, right? And, I mean, like, what's going on the other side of after the diploma comes through? So,
I want to talk in a minute or two. I want to talk about, is there room for AI in this process and what you're seeing so far. But first, I want to talk a little bit about just the list architecture. So for maybe I'll ask you, Jay, first, and then I'll ask Steve. How do you prefer to categorize schools in terms of like, we sometimes hear reach for the highly selectives, match, and then likely. What terms do you like, Jay? And then Steve, what terms do you like?
If we're talking about admissions, like from that
When
standpoint
a,
of like
when a student, and let me add to that question. When you're thinking about like, okay, here's what I tell students, apply to X number of schools and Y number in each category, quote unquote. So what are the categories and how many schools are you encouraging them to apply to?
I think of sometimes when I start saying safety schools, it changes the conversation about those schools. So I like to say like strong odds, right? Like we're in a good place. This is a good school that feels good when we apply 50-50 low and lowest.
Mhm.
Because even saying a school's a reach school doesn't give you a lot of clarity. Um, as in, I have some students that work really, really hard and will want to apply to Harvard. Well, we know their acceptance rate, regular decision, is going to be probably below 2%, right? So it should be a reach for everyone. But is the farthest reach or is it like a potential, right? Like, or I know this is really diving into a lot of it, but um, understanding where they're at in their profile, like some of these schools are going to be really hard to I guess it's part of the strategy as well, a conversation that we always have, is understanding where you're at within that. But in addition, we've started sharing likelihood with early decision just because how it plays out sometimes. And, we can think about Tulane. That's one school where I will say, this is a likely if you're going early decision, and it's a possibly a reach in regular decision. And so I think sometimes that's not trying to force a hand on to a student, but it to at least bringing up the conversation that when we talk about colleges, the admissions, we look at the college first, and then second, how they do their admissions profile, as in how do they build their class, right? And what's the way that they do it in terms of early decision, all those other things. And then last, the student profile. And I think when we look at those first two buckets, we before we even get to the student, we can say Harvard is a reach school for everyone, right? Like we can say some of those things within that. But Steve, actually, do you mind sharing as well?
Sure, of course. Um, I wish the college planning world would get rid of the word reach, target, and backup. Um, and the reason is that what we're talking about when we categorize schools is admissions likelihood. So I prefer low chance of admission schools, medium chance of admission schools, and high chance of admission schools. I believe that the word reach sounds aspirational and it sounds like it's better
Mhm.
in some way. It's but the important thing is to keep in mind that we're just talking about admission. I also don't like backup because it sounds like a booby prize. It sounds like who would ever want to go to a backup
Yeah.
after all. Um, which reminds me that everyone needs good colleges in all three categories or whatever you call the categories. Um, and it's very easy these days to I think to some extent it's maybe easier to find low chance of admission schools than high chance of admission schools for some students. Um, but it's important that everyone has high chance of admission schools that they are comfortable with and they would go to and they
Right.
would be happy at. And if I could drill that into students, that concept, and most of the time I fail at being able to do that, but I sure try.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest ways that I see stress come down. When students say, "Hey, I'm stressed about this process," I'll ask them, how many schools do you have on your list that you're excited about and that you're more than 50%, you have, greater than a 60% chance of getting in there? And I'll ask that on like big webinars and see who raises their hand. And I'll tell you, the students who have a school that they're excited about and that they can get into, there's just like this, there's this sense of like, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to get in somewhere. And a way that I'm hearing y'all frame it, which I really like, is thinking of this not as sort of like Stanford or bust. If I, defining success in terms of like, if I get into this school, then I've been a successful process. And if not, it's just like degrees of failure. But rather, there's this sense of what I hear you saying, like foundational schools that are like, here are the schools that I'm excited about that I can get into. And anything that's harder to get into beyond that is like awesome. But if I can focus my attention and energy on finding those schools that, like you're saying, I can get into and then I can fall in love with, boy, that's the sweet spot.
It is so very true.
And
And also I do want to also add, even though I mentioned three categories: low chance of admission, medium, and high, these days, schools like Stanford, Harvard, most of the Ivies, I don't even classify them as low chance of admission. I classify them as wild cards.
right,
They're
right,
just so unpredictable. I mean, you have to remember that colleges are looking more about what's best for them than they are whether a particular student is right for them.
Mhm.
In other words, when admissions decisions are made, it's often made on the basis of, do we need more chemistry students? Do we need more students from Montana? Do we need this or that? That has nothing to do with the students' accomplishments in high school. And I think the more we can pass along that message, the more it may reduce a little bit of stress from students and parents who think that colleges are looking at this candidate and they're looking at their activities and their recommendations, and that they're making a decision on all of those factors alone.
right,
Right.
right.
I,
And just to, I think, to jump on this and to clarify for folks, what Steve is saying here is not that colleges are quote unquote out to get students or they have some like nefarious thing where they're trying to like obscure things. They actually just have a whole crap ton of things that they're trying to fulfill. They call them institutional priorities. We talk about them on a lot of different webinars. And they're not only are they not incentivized to share what those are, but just imagine how that would the kind of tizzy that would throw folks into if they're like, we're looking for 3 new oboe players. First of all, how would they even communicate about that? And then what kind of mania would that create in sort of like in the world? And to your point earlier, colleges are changing so fast. So they're just kind of getting these updates and finding out from the symphony, oh, wow, we do need some oboe players. All right, cool. Let's start to look for that. So I think the point that you're making here is a really good one, which is like, there's only so much you can do. Like work hard and create a great application, apply to a wide range of schools, but ultimately,
yeah.
it's in the hands of the gods.
Well, yes, and I try to convince students not to personalize an acceptance or a rejection. That's practically impossible to do, and I recognize that. But I do think, as you say, that once they realize that the admissions office has a whole host of other factors other than what you have done in high school, I think it can relieve a little bit of the tension.
Yeah. So, but I want to also hear, give me a range, a student coming into this process, how many schools should I apply to? Give me the short answer also. What's a good range? Is it 5 schools? Is it 12 schools? Like what would you say, Jay, in terms of like a good number of schools? I know it depends, but kind of give me a range here.
Okay, I don't want to answer with a number yet. Because, Steve and I care about the student process first. And so for me, when a senior's coming in, what I ask them is I want them to give me their hot, medium, and mild level of interest, right? So like, okay, so UVA is hot, but where's William and Mary? Where's everything in between? Because I think it has to again start with the student. You're in control of this process. And instead of you just like, if you just put an order, I don't see actually when you get to what point are you done in your actual interest level, right? When I have some students that will say, I looked into the schools and I'll apply to those others, but I really only want 2 schools. Then I realized, okay, we actually have a problem, right? Just because you're applying to 8 schools doesn't mean that we're actually set up well for this process. So I've started to think about it a little bit like portfolios of investments, right? The sense of like how level of risk are we taking on in this process and measuring it accordingly. Like some students will have to conserve a conservative list, right? But and they might not know about other markets. But I also try and assess like a student's level of risk that they want to take on and stress for their senior year. Um, I know I haven't given you a number yet, but because like I'm saying like there's this potential that a student applies to only one school early, and then they're applying to all these gamble schools, their regular decision, and it just puts an immense amount of stress on what their senior year is because it's all about just again holding on to these lottery schools. And so I think for me like if a school's not hot on their list, it's where I kind of start and stop the conversation. So I need schools that are going to be strong odds, right? That we are hot on or that we're really excited about. And if not, then I still think we need to do a little bit more research, right? So maybe, Steve, you give a number because I won't.
All right, great. Rejecting the
Yeah,
prompt, totally fine to do. Steve,
you
how many
know,
schools does a student apply to?
I, I, I,
Wait, wait.
I, I think that 12 to 15 these days, and it's mainly because of merit aid and financial aid. I do think that students need to apply to more colleges in 2025 than they did in 2020. I think that the need-based situation is changing. The merit-based situation is always variable. And so I believe that 12 to 15, and that's a lot. I mean, that's many more than I would have advised in 2020. But I think given that cost is such a major factor, I really think that for most students, they need the variability that comes with 10 or a little bit more colleges to apply to.
Right, thanks.
Sorry, I just want to keep going with this riffing because I think that it is like the element of us talking about financial fit is a huge part of how many colleges should we be applying to, right? Like to your point, Steve, and what you're sharing, if, a student for me is looking at financial fit, the list is going to look different, but also then how we can compare the different options between the student is a huge part of that process. I also have sometimes students that are going more than one direction, as in I would love to go to a BSMD, but I know that's a prayer, right? To get into those incredibly selective programs where I get straight into med school. Or, maybe I'm also looking at a sport, but if I don't play a sport, these are also my list, right? And so those lists grow and that's okay for them to be a little bit more. But at the same time, I still want them to apply to schools that they've found themselves interested in. And so if it's too short of a list, then we're kicking it further down to say, let's do more on it. But there's always a conversation about what that looks like individually.
Yeah. So I promised we'd talk about AI a little bit. So I want to hear from you, either of you, whoever feels like answering. What's a responsible way for students to use AI in the process? Have you seen students using AI to research? What's your sense about that?
I've had some good moments and some not as great moments where like I give a list to a kid and go research it. And sometimes it's like a lazy process. And I appreciate that people are starting to create more language around what AI is, right? Like it's supposed to be a tool for humans and not necessarily becoming its own person. And so I think as when it's always put as an aid, it's always helpful. For instance, I think it's really helpful when looking up why would I want to study this major at this college, right? I like that they can sometimes University of Wisconsin has that's kind of their prompt. And so to be able to see like, here's the different things that they're offering, here's the institutes, right? That's really helpful in that way. When we're talking specifics about a college, I like it. I've found that when students are looking at for financial fit, it can give some numbers that aren't always the most accurate to a student's profile, right? As in, some schools might actually really give scholarships and they're just writing them off pretty quickly because they don't know that they're actually in a really good place to be receiving more money from that school. So I'm just a little reluctant to place too much emphasis on it in the financial fit element, um, especially when we talk about public universities as well. But I found that when we're talking about specifics and I come with a specific question that I want to prompt it with, I always feel like it's a good starting point to help your research win. Instead of when you, like a lot of times students are asked to by colleges, just even this week, Georgia Tech was saying like, oh, just get on our website. And I'm like, that's asking a lot, And I really like AI for that, where it's like someone else can, can search that website a lot faster than I can. So.
Steve, what's your sense? Would you add anything to that?
Well, asking me whether students should use AI, it would be like asking me whether students should use Google. Of course,
Yeah.
they should use AI. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a new tool. There's a tremendous database of information. I am all for students um, responsibly using AI as they would responsibly use Google or just generally the internet. Um, but AI is good for many questions in the search process, and it's not just tell me good schools in accounting or something. As I mentioned, that's, as far as I'm concerned, very elusive. But to ask what it's like to live in Charleston, for
Mhm.
example, is a good thing to do.
Mhm.
To ask about values of smaller schools and bigger schools, talking about or interacting with AI on some of the qualities that you're looking for in a college. I think that can be very helpful. Clearly, AI, even Claude, does not know a student and
Right.
does not, to ask what is the best match or something, you really have to rely on your counselor, your consultant, your parents, and others. But to use AI for research is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, there's a guide that I'll link in the show notes here that's like a sort of a step-by-step guide that for those of you who are like, yeah, but what are the things that I do? It's all mapped out for you there. It's the one that I put together when we did the podcast the first time, but it's like, here are the resources to figure out what you're looking for. I think they're great resources. And then there's like, here are the places to find them, including the book. Including there's a quick and dirty list builder that Mark Moody put together, which stay
Yeah.
tuned. The next podcast, Mark and I talk about that. That's another great starting place. But to your point, Steve, in terms of helping students figure out what they're looking for, I put together a little what I call my college preferences template with my counseling team. And it helps students to figure out, okay, here are the things that I'm interested in at college. So it's kind of a synthesis really of some of your resources. They can fill it out in about 10 minutes and then they can put it into ChatGPT or something like that and say, hey, be a college admission expert with, encyclopedic knowledge of colleges and universities. Give me a list of 10 schools and universities that might, fit my interests. And it's going to give students a pretty good starting place. And I'll link to this again in the show notes. I think it doesn't replace the sort of internal work and the nutritional value of sort of figuring out what you're looking for. I think that's really important to do, but it is a quick way of doing it. And then I think a really important next step is to actually then go research those things and find the place on the website. And ChatGPT can really help you with that too. You can ask specifically, hey, I'm interested in doing original works of theater at Northwestern University. what opportunities might be available. And ChatGPT will give me specific links, ask for the specific links, and it'll give you specific links that you can then go research. Side note, I'd have to say this, don't then be like, okay, now write my YS essay. Don't use it to write your essays for you. But I think it can be a great way to speed up the research. So again, I'll link to that in the show notes.
Let me just say, Ethan, that I think the template that you've developed is a great one. And I encourage students to use it.
Great, thanks. Side note to folks who are listening live, we're going to extend just by a few minutes here because I've got a couple more questions I want to make sure we get to. And then in a few minutes, we're also going to give away some books. In fact, Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind, actually just taking a look at everybody who's filled out the form and just give us 5 names of folks. We'll just randomly choose folks who will get a copy of the College Finder, and we'll reach out via email to mail them to you. And I want to just thank you all for being willing to give out some free copies of the book. It's a tremendous, tremendous resource. I'd love to shift and talk just for a minute about early decision, early action. And I know we could do a whole podcast on this, but it came up earlier, and I think that it's something that students think about when they're trying to figure out where should I apply. I'd love to just hear maybe Jay from you first. How do you have that early action, early decision conversation with folks, and what are some of the considerations?
Man, that's a good one. Um, well, obviously, early decision is that I always like to hold up my ring and, put it on and say, I thee wed myself to, right? And it's one of those that when we start to talk about early decision, if that's a consideration, have you visited or, taken an extensive amount of look into all their online resources that you feel like this would be a place that you'd be happy? And then second, have you done the net price calculator? Because any school that should have early decision is going to have that as an opportunity for them to look at. And I think that that might be a part of that kind of first ground level. But to me, there's the strategy I think is a little bit of the conversation about like, okay, but how interested are you in each of these schools first and foremost, and putting together a plan? I I get nervous when a lot of students punt everything to regular decision. Um, as in, there are a number of schools that are early decision only in the fall, right? And those tend to be some of the most selective schools in the country. And applying to those schools exclusively means that you can only apply to one in the fall, and then therefore the rest are in January.
Mhm.
And so I encourage students when they're in that position to look at some other early action schools and how we can grow um, that list just to be able to have a little bit more, I like to say, just like some good news for Christmas, like that we might have something that comes through a little bit more in that. And then, early action again has some different deadlines, which is frustrating because I don't want to bag on North Carolina, but they have the slowest return rate and on giving an announcement, right? You apply on October 15th, which is early, by the way, and they don't tell you until February if you're in the runnings. And that's hard for a student that is looking at early decision one, which is typically November, or early decision two, which I think we need to come up with some new terms, but which is in January, right? Where we could go binding to another school. And but if you're really holding out hope on that school, that becomes again this question of like our investments, right? Like how risky are we running this senior year and what you're carrying out into April that you're waiting to hear from.
Right.
So yeah. So that's some of the stuff that I think through early on in the fall semester of thinking through those possibilities.
Yeah. Steve, is there anything you'd add to that?
Early action is normally a no-brainer. I mean, if a school offers early action, it simply means that you will hear earlier. And so I encourage students to do early action whenever they can do it.
Yeah.
Early decision, on the other hand, what troubles me about my training programs with consultants and talking about early decision is the conversation is almost exclusively about admission and not about fit.
Mm-hmm.
And that worries me because I want to help students get into the school that they want to get into and that fits best. But I also want to be concerned about that fit. And so I approach early decision with caution. I think there are many students who are totally focused on admission and probably should do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are an equal number of students who maybe are not ready by November 1st or something to really know what school is right for them. And so I like to at least have a conversation about the pros and cons of early decision.
Good. Yeah. Sorry,
Jump
you
in,
can
please.
say something,
No,
Ethan,
please.
but I was going to jump on to one other thing
Oh,
I was thinking about.
please.
Um, well, I was also thinking about, like, I do think early action is a no-brainer, what Steve said. Like, it is one of those that will encourage, especially some, like, Big Ten schools, when they fill up, it just becomes a lot harder as an out-of-state student. And so it's one that we do encourage. Um, but then also the only other thing is there's a small handful, I don't want to overemphasize testing, but there is some schools that do require testing. I'm in the Southeast, and so that's the only that's another consideration is like, are you still in a place where you're figuring out testing and not to again put an over reliance on it, but if we want to wait till January or February for that, then great, then we give ourselves a little bit more runway.
Yeah. First of all, side note, congratulations to the winners of the book. We just posted 5 winners in the chat. Congratulations. And like I mentioned, we're going to spend a few more minutes on questions here that I've got still, and then we're going to get to the Q&A with y'all. So we'll probably go for another 10 minutes or so. Uh, Jay, talk to us about the role of parents in the process. What do you feel like are some of the sort of best practices for how parents can best support their students as they're going through this phase of the process as part of like the college search?
I really like this question. Because I think I have a lot of empathy for parents, is that you are receiving an intense amount of messaging and anxiety, and there's a lot of marketing that is like perpetuating this, like keeping me up at night. Um, but I have students almost every year that come into my office and they say, I don't want to, we don't talk about that C word, right? Because college is scary um, and it's draining and it's an identity warping process. It's disheartening. And when you get down to it, it feels really bad. But parents, if I can ask you, if you are focusing on the admissions process, again, I feel like Steve and I are saying a similar message here, then you are going to provoke a lot of anxiety in this process, right? Without intentionally or unintentionally. And you might have a hard time seeing your child for who they are. But if you focus on how great a college experience could be, then you will find that your child will get excited alongside with you, right? Like there's a sense of like this could be cool. Like did you know they had rugby as well, right? Like that's awesome. Like like finding some places where we can see what the possibilities of 4 years of life. The joke is that we shouldn't spend longer applying to a school than the amount of time it takes to go to a school, right? So, but there is still that preparation. So like ninth and 10th grade, go if you're in town and go visit a college. It's great. It's just getting some time and some feet on the campus is great, and starting to workshop some of those questions that we were talking about earlier is a great opportunity to go and see what they would find unique about it. But I also, when they're there, I would love if you can help to facilitate them understanding the difference between a high school and a college. And
Mm,
I know it sounds ridiculous, but like there are a lot of girls' schools and there are a select number of women's colleges. And if you can tell the difference between the two, you're so much further ready for this process, And
mm,
or oh, my high school is the same size as Davidson. Why would I ever go there, right? there is some sense of like, well, can you understand and ask those questions about what happens socially that's different on a college campus than the high school? So I think a lot of that ninth and 10th grade is starting to prep in that direction. 11th grade, the things I want to ask about is, can we get a good understanding about what money looks like, and where that conversation, it's not like you have to share everything about here's where our bank accounts are, but I do think there is a place to say, this is what we think is going to be a too much for us price tag. And I think that reality can help to align expectations as the list building process is going on. And the second thing that I would say is, testing does come up in the Southeast more than in California, but it does. That in that process, just second semester junior year is when nationally students score they don't score their best before second semester in junior year. And so starting to just like get something on the books sometime in the second semester of that junior year, I think is really helpful. So and then the 12th grade, this is my challenge to you parents. We talk about outcomes for a while now, but it's now up to you when we're holding your feet to the fire, as in think about the qualities that you've encouraged in your child for so long. Like you've encouraged them to self-advocate, to find their voice, to be honest in their process and in their work, to, these character qualities that we really care about. And so I just hearken you, don't overtake the process because of your stress. And I would just say, if maybe it would be worth reaching out to your counselor just with some of those questions on the front end, instead of keep bringing it up over and over to your child, because you're not just building this kid to go to college, right? Like that's not been your whole process for 18 years. Like in a lot of ways, you've been trying to map out towards this like well-developed 35-year-old, right? So keep like that end in mind and not just like this pressure. And I think there's a lot of times that parents will say like, their senior year, like I'm way more stressed than them, or I feel like I'm going a little crazy. And I think that's a conversation maybe to have with the counselor if they're willing. And then to also like recognize what the character qualities that you want from your child in the long run.
I have a practical thing for this that I like to suggest, and it's that we started off with this roles and identities a little bit, and it's an exercise that I talk about for students in terms of what are the roles that you played in your life. But I really love to suggest this one for families, and I'll put it in the chat and we'll follow up with it. But the exercise here is, as a parent, you look at this list of roles and identities, and you ask yourself a couple questions. You ask yourself, what are the roles that I could play in this process? So I see, for example, I could be the organizer. I could be the energizer. I could be the challenger. So there are all these potential roles that I could play. And then ask yourself two more questions. What roles will I not play? And what roles will I play? So for me, for instance, I hope to not play the organizer in terms of organizing my daughter when she's, 7 years going through this process, to be the one who like organizes all the things. But I do want to be a question asker. I do want to ask difficult questions. So that's a fun little exercise. It only takes maybe 10 minutes, but it can sort of get you to orient and go, how do I want to show up in this process? So it's sort of a specific way of doing exactly what you're talking about, Jay. I love that.
Thank you.
Steve, as we get close to closing here, I'd love to know something practical for students. Give us something that, let's say, a senior, a rising senior, could focus on a couple months from application season when they're getting ready to submit. What's something that you'd suggest that might help them shift their mindset around this process, or like a concrete action that you feel like maybe students sometimes miss?
Well, one question I think that they should ask is whether college is right for me immediately after high school.
Yeah.
It's not too late as a senior to think about that. There are lots and lots of studies that show success in college after somebody has taken a gap year or worked for a year or done some community service. So one of the things that I would ask is that. Another thing I would suggest that seniors do is to be certain that their college list is not created so they can outdo one of their peers in their high school. I see too many students that are, my list is better than your list because it has more competitive colleges and all of that. That is such a waste of time and really doesn't further someone's exploration of good fit colleges. And the last thing I would say to someone who is a senior um, and has a list or thinks they have a list is to go up to the top of a mountain, or if you don't live near a mountain, the top of a hill, and just think for a few minutes. Just think about who you are. Think about whether your list really reflects who you are as opposed to what your parents might think of you or others might think of you. I think just taking a moment to self-reflect in the senior year is something I don't see enough students do.
I love this. I want to ask you both, what are some, maybe give me like two or three, I know you could, because you could give me a bunch. Give me two or three resources that you think are really important in this process, and we'll link to them all in the show notes. And it could be either the college search process, or it could be, just sort of like the college admission process, with a side note to say, we're going to say, of course, The College Finder by Jay McCann and Steve Antonoff, which again, we'll link to in the show notes. But what are some other favorite resources that you'd like to put on folks' radar? Either of you can go first.
Jay, do you want to start? Or do you want me to?
Sure, go for it.
I think the Fisk Guide to Colleges is probably a must. I think that following colleges on Instagram, I think there's a lot of good information that is available, and I would encourage students to do that. There are some very, very good college tour websites, college campus reel and campus tours, campus tour singular are two good ones. I find College Navigator information to be reliable and good. Those are some of the websites and some of the books that I like.
Love it. Jay, you got a couple?
Well, the funny thing is, Steve has on his website a full list of like lots of resources, that you can follow as well. So he would be happy to share even more.
Thanks.
Maybe what I would say is thinking about like engaging in this process. Like two ones that I commonly will point parents towards when they are very much in the prestige fixated mindset is just this Challenge Success Initiative by Stanford's College of Education. And they look at, how much does selectivity matter, and, like how much should we place weight on that? Making Caring Common initiative, Harvard's College of Education had. And what I like about that one is they have red flags for parents. And so it might be like a nice like check, like how am I doing? Or maybe ask your child how you're doing to fill it out for you. As a parent and engaging this process. But by and large, what we've seen is that students that are engaged in college, and engagement is one of the best predictors of how people do and outcomes, right? And so the Purdue and Gallup study has been around for over 10 years. It's one of the biggest studies where they surveyed graduates on what was a good, what made for them set up well for life, right? For doing life after, for career, for feeling like they're thriving in those things. And I'll share it with you all. But I like it for when you take a campus visit to look at what ways are professors interacting. Are they mentoring? Are there opportunities for long-term engagement that's longer one semester? And so asking some of those questions, I think, help to um, get a better sense of what fit could be on a campus tour.
Yeah.
And hearing Jay mention those reminds me of a couple of others, if I could. I think Carleton College Career Pathways is a great website. You can really see where people that are majoring in certain things, where they end up in their career. So I like that very much. Education Planner has some good inventories on learning style and study habits and career planning. I also like the Search Institute's developmental assets. That's something that parents and students can talk about. The Search Institute is very empathetic and has some really good good information and good aspirational directions for young adults.
Yeah. This is all wonderful. And oh, side note, the Making Caring Common thing. Last year I interviewed Trisha Ross Anderson, who helps to head up that project, and we'll link to that in the show notes. But they're deep into helping colleges figure out what they want when they're looking for students. So that's a really neat organization. I want to take a few questions here from the audience, as it were. A couple of them are kind of low-hanging fruit, so I'm going to answer them. One is, how does the College Finder differ from Fisk? You can feel free to add to this, but the Fisk guide is sort of like, once you're thinking about the schools, here's what to get to know about each of the schools with these short blurbs and descriptions. Whereas the College Finder is just a book of the lists. So it's sort of like finding out what the colleges are. So I would say that they pair nicely, and that the College Finder is where you start out to figure out, what are the schools that match some of the stuff that you're looking for. And then once you find those schools, the Fisk guide, or using what I suggested in terms of ChatGPT, will help you do that research. The second question that came in was, for international students that need financial aid, sometimes the search is basically based on which schools give financial aid or scholarships, which isn't all that many. So how do we find fit, or, the best thing for a particular major when the list is so restrictive? For you and other students who are on the call who are, in this similar situation, we have a whole like web page of, guides for international students. Like, it's a whole application hub. And I want to encourage you to read through some of the things to consider. I will say we do have a comprehensive guide that's specifically for high need international students, that talks about how the search for you is just a little bit different. And you are going to want to first sort for what are those schools that are likely to meet need. And then I would say within that list of schools, start to look at, okay, what does fit look like? Rather than sort of going, well, what are all the schools? So use that money filter first, and you'll see there's a guide on how to do that. And a really amazing student, who came forward one year and was like, hey, I've found those schools, and has a really neat thing that he put together called Auxilia that'll help you find that. There's also some amazing resources from our colleagues, Jeff Levy and Jenny Kent, that have spreadsheets and sortable things that'll help you figure out that more. Also, we'll follow up with that. Here's a good one, though, and I'd love to hear maybe from you, Steve. How do you find a school, I'm just going to read this as it's written, that is more conservative, as they all seem so liberal?
Well, that is not the case. There are many, many schools that are more conservative. In the community chapter in College Finder, we have a number of lists of colleges that are more conservative politically. There are also lists related to colleges that are a bit more conservative socially. So while the national headlines would suggest that higher education in the U.S. is all liberal, there are plenty of exceptions to that rule.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you. And part of that is just finding those. And also, it's interesting. I love what you're saying, is that it's depending on sort of how you're defining conservative, because there
Yeah,
are.
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of, Jay, I'll give you this one. Do you have any advice for a student who figures out their fit school is a private school, but it's too expensive, beyond filling out the FAFSA, especially if that student likely can't fit into need-based criteria, but they may have merit fit?
Okay, so the college is a great school, but it's not a financial fit. Is that how I'm hearing it?
What's to be done if they're like, great, it's awesome, but I just don't know that I'm going to be able to afford it? What's to be done?
Um, the truth is there are some schools that will not be a financial fit for many. And I think that it's a conversation that you have as a family. But then there's like what I always find like there's like 3,500 colleges out there or whatever that number is of institutions. There are a lot more possibilities, and then we can look at what we love about this school and try to also find who are our cluster friends in that. And maybe that's even a question for AI, right? Like saying like, hey, I found this school, but it's not going to be financially a really good fit. Let's run it through that lens of who are some other schools that might be a little bit better from a price point. Um, and and what they said was that they wanted more merit aid. Was that what you said?
Yeah, if the student likely can't fit into need-based criteria, but they may have merit fit.
Right. Okay. And I think, one of the like broad sweeping ways of thinking about colleges for scholarships is again, like I said, like the higher the ranking, the less money you're going to receive in scholarships. The coast and the cities, like the highest real estate places, probably expect a little bit less as well. And so I'm trying to like be a little bit more open to what those possibilities could be. It's part of the search process. It's part of that giving priorities towards what the possibilities could be. So
All right, last question here. Would you develop or is there already an app to find the best fit from the book? I love this question. Is it
There,
forthcoming?
there is not an app, but that's a good idea. And we're all ears for any ways that we can make College Finder more accessible and more helpful.
mhm.
Well,
A
thanks.
lot of ideas that we have. So there's fun things that we're throwing around about it. And honestly, we'd love if you go to thecollegefinder.net and subscribe. We'd love to keep you updated with things as they develop for us.
Yeah, let's close with that. We'll put that link in the chat here, but and we'll follow up, of course, via email. But I'd love to just say, thank you to both of you for all the work that went into this, because I know it was a true labor of love that put into creating this resource that's going to be helpful for so many students. And yeah, thanks for being here with me today and with us today. And if there are any counselors on the call, hey, we're doing a little book signing at the national conference next week. So we're hoping Steve's going to be able to be there. He's got some other big things that he's working on, but you can certainly come by, meet Jay, and come say hello. So we'll have that at the college essay guy booth. I think it's 1512 is the booth number. So again,
Well, we certainly are very grateful to you, Ethan, for featuring the College Finder and for helping us. And I also want to put in a plug for your resources and your books, which I recommend often to my students. So thank you both for your contributions to the field and for highlighting our work today.
Absolutely. That yeah, we could even go back to Ethan helping us on some of these surveys that we helped develop the book. So he has been an integral part of even this book coming to fruition. So
well, it's my honor and my privilege. So thank you both. And thanks to all of you who hung on till the bitter end here and stayed with us a little bit later tonight. Hope you all have a beautiful evening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.